All right, it's Peter Cole, and I'm back with part 4 of my intro to sample libraries. These are a number of videos I'm doing for beginners. So if you're just starting out and trying to figure out how to make your orchestra sound good, and even just to get things to work properly, these are the videos for you. So in this video, we're going to start to just scratch the surface on MIDI programming. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at some of the parameters that you can use within your DAW to make your orchestra recordings sound, your sample orchestra recordings sound more realistic. Now, there are a ton of these parameters, and I'm just starting off with two sort of concepts here. And at first, they might seem a little bit random and arbitrary, but I have a story to tell you as to why they're important to me, because I learned a big lesson from these two in particular. And the two in particular are the note length and the velocity. So in the video before this video, which I will link to in the description below, which was part 3 of the series, I talked about articulations and when to use the right articulation for the right job. And this is a great segue into that because it's really kind of picking up where that one left off. And a lot of this lesson here today is really about that, about making sure you're picking the right articulation, even within the context of note length. So now for that story. Years ago, when I was first starting out and I was making music and I was submitting it to publishers to be used in film and TV projects, often I would get, actually very often, I would get feedback about my music, and they'd say, you know, the songwriting's great, or the composition's great, production's good, but the sample libraries you're using suck. They don't sound good. And that was bewildering to me because I was using really good stuff from Spitfire, and I had LA scoring strings back then, which is a great library. I still use it today. East West. I mean, I had good stuff. So I knew there must have been something about how I was programming the samples. It couldn't be the sample libraries because, I mean, they were good. They were top of the line. So then one day, one of the publishers said, I got some feedback, and this particular guy said, well, look, I think you should look into the note length and, you know, the articulations that you're choosing, because it seems like the sound you're after, you're not programming it that way. It was the first time I'd ever gotten this feedback before. Every other time it was like, well, your libraries suck. So that's kind of the starting point and the reason why I'm focusing at those concepts in this video. So we're going to talk about making sure you choose the right articulation, and particularly in the context of note length, just in this example. And then we'll also talk about velocity. And velocity, of course, is more about how hard you hit the instrument. So now we're going to jump into my DAW, and I'm going to go through an example. And this particular example was exactly the type of thing I was doing back then. I was doing fast-paced music, action-type music with a lot of quick runs. And this example that we're going to do today is really focused more on that. We're using this sort of fast action-style music to explain these concepts. Okay, so now I'm inside my DAW. I have Contact open, as you can see. I have a couple of patches there, a few patches there, but for now we're going to be mostly focused on this cello patch right here. And the first articulation we're talking about is staccato. So again, I would urge you to go back and watch the previous video in this series, video 3, about articulations, where I go into a lot more detail about the different articulations. But for right now, remember, staccato is a short note. And that was what I was after back in the day when I was learning how to do this stuff. I knew I wanted a short note, but I wasn't super skilled in knowing all the different articulation types. So I figured staccato would probably be short enough. So I picked staccato, and let's hear what that sounds like. So that's pretty short, right? I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, that's got to be short enough. How could it get any shorter than that? However, listen closely to how long the note actually rings out. So yes, it's short, but there's still some body to it. There's still, of course, reverb, of course, but it's not like a super short note, and you'll see why more when we look into this. Okay, so now I'm going to bring up the composition. This is something I did just for this lesson, but it's similar to the style of music I was doing back in the day when I was learning how to mess around with my samples. And this was kind of the style. So again, I have staccato articulation selected, and I thought that was pretty short. But if you listen to this, can you hear almost like a, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like a wobble. I mean, it's fast, and the notes are short, but it just doesn't sound, it doesn't have the attack and bite that I should have been after back in the day, right? And this was probably why I was getting that feedback, right? They're like, hey man, like the song sounds cool, but that sample is not working. And you know, the feedback, they didn't know exactly what it was, so they assumed it was the sample library, but in reality I just wasn't choosing the right articulation. So that's step one. Let me bring my mixer back up. Okay, so now I've opened up Contact again, and I have my Celli patch loaded, Spitfire chamber strings, and of course staccato is selected, which is what we just heard. I don't like that. I don't know about you, but it's just too... The notes are lasting too long. It doesn't have the attack. It doesn't have the bite that I'm after. So although staccato is a short articulation, it's not the shortest. In fact, spiccato is the shortest. So let's listen to this one. All right, so now already that baby's sounding a lot better. Let's listen to staccato again. You see the difference? Back to spiccato. So spiccato just has much more bite. It's got great bite, and the notes are not as long. I believe the way the player plays is they're almost like bouncing off the strings. That gives you that really fast, tight sound. So step one, pick the right articulation. In this case, again, it's a fast action style. So I'm going to want something that has the shortest note possible, so it can go really quick. And the notes, because you notice with the spiccato or staccato, sorry, it's almost like the notes start to blur together. Listen to this again. Right? You're losing definition. You're losing definition as the notes almost start to blur together. So we want spiccato. Now we got some. Now we got somewhere, right? That sounded a lot better. The next thing we're gonna look at is the actual MIDI note length. As the playhead is moving across the score, the MIDI score, as soon as it hears that, or as soon as it sees this note here, it's gonna play it, and it'll decay out as long as this is. You know, it kind of depends on the sample. Different sample libraries and different instruments are different. So I'm just calling this out so you're aware of it. In some cases, certain notes are going to last as long as the MIDI note lasts for. So if you go like this, it's going to only last that long. Now, in the case of a spiccato, it's so short, it's just going to play that note and it'll be over before the actual physical note has ended in the MIDI score. But this is something to still be aware of, and I always like to tighten these up to get really as small as possible, just in case there's some lingering reverb or sound in there. And you got to play with it, because it really depends on the sample library and the instrument. The other thing that is really important, particularly with this style of music, is if you listen, each time you hear the metronome click, that annoying clicking sound you're hearing, those are clicking on all these downbeats, right? So all these, where you see the gray line, all those are downbeats, right? Click, click, dun 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 dun. Now, the thing with sample libraries are, believe it or not, there is just a little bit of space at the beginning of the note as the player is bowing up or bowing down, whatever they happen to be doing. So they're getting into the note before that full attack. There's just a microscopic amount of time in there, and it's almost hard to really hear or appreciate. But when you're playing it back, oftentimes the notes will just lag a little bit. They won't hit the attack won't hit on that downbeat because of that little bit of space that's in the sample. And it's not too bad in this example because it's a spiccato and it's going really quick, but I will often play around with the position of the note. So again, if you look here, the downbeat is right here on this line. So I'll select all the samples and I will move it over a little bit, and that will allow, and again, you got to play around with this. It's going to be different for every every instrument, every sample library, every articulation. You know, like a slow legato articulation is going to have a long, or a longer, I should say. Don't want to get too dramatic here. It'll have a longer bow up, and that's going to make that the sound of the attack delay even longer. So if you're trying to hit those beats, you got to account for it even more when you move your notes around. So in this example, as you see, as the playhead moves, it's going to immediately start playing that sample, and the attack of the sample hopefully will hit right around here, along with all the other instruments that are playing in my composition. So again, very hard to give you like an absolute science for this, because you really got to play around with it, and it's something to be aware of to get an even sharper attack. So let's listen to this now that I've nudged over the sample to start a little earlier. I might have done a little too much. That sounds a little too aggressive. So you, again, play around with it. There's no exact science. I think there's some libraries like Jaeger by Audio Imperia, which I have, and I just got it, so I haven't had a chance to play around with it much. Excuse me. And maybe there's some people who know more about it that can leave comments in the comment section. But I believe in some of their libraries, they include like an actual offset within the software to account for this type of stuff. I think they do it for the percussion too. And that's great, because then you don't have to fiddle around necessarily with your MIDI notes too much. You kind of set a universal offset, if you think of it that way, within the software, and then you can have everything line up nice and clean within your MIDI layout here. So that's pretty cool. And again, I haven't played with that enough to be an expert, and for all I know, I'm completely wrong, and they don't do that. So being aware of that offset is not as bad on the shorter notes. Let's listen to that again. Pretty good. But let's do an extreme example. I'm just doing this to be dramatic here and show you how extreme this can be. I'm going to mute my spiccato cello as well as the violin that I have selected here, and I'm going to go to one of the libraries that's notorious. I love this library. This is the Tina Guo cello from Cinesamples, probably one of my favorite libraries ever, but it's meant for slow pieces. And it actually is not very good for fast stuff. And this is one of the exact reasons why, because of that offset between when Tina starts her bowing to when it hits the full attack is quite long, and you can't do fast passages with it. So let's listen to, let's see if I can get it to play. I mean, that's extreme, right? That's probably obnoxious. Let me see if I can. Do you hear the kind of the? So watch my hand. I mean, obviously this is not scientific or anything, but watch how, you can hear what, or you can see what a gap it is before the full attack hits. So it's great for slow, emotional type playing, and that's what this library is fantastic for. And I'm only using this as an extreme example to really hopefully hit home what I'm talking about. I would obviously never pick this sample library to use for a fast action piece, so I would never do that to begin with. But I'm just doing this to kind of exaggerate the issue that you got to be aware of. So far, we've been listening to the fast action piece, and that's really the focus of this lesson. But just to give you another example, this is a slow run using Tina Guo cello. Let's listen to how it... So if you look here, I have all the notes starting right on those downbeats, right? The problem is, again, the attack of the note is hitting probably somewhere around, here. So you can't tell totally when there's not like, drums and other instruments going on. But if you had to have this performance line up with all the other action that's going on and hitting all those beats, you would probably... Whoa, sorry about that. You would probably select the instruments and you'd want to, give it a little more time to... And to be honest, I think I would probably even stretch it out even more. Again, it depends a lot on how fast it's going and what else is going on in the piece. And I'm not going to get too critical here, but just so you're aware, be aware of that when you're starting your programming. Be aware of when the actual attack of the instrument is, the attack of the note in the sample, I should say, is hitting. It'll be different. Different libraries, different instruments, different library companies. Always just be aware of that. All right, so that was the quick lesson on note length. And again, you want to first start with the correct articulation. So I keep repeating myself here, but be sure to watch the video that came before this one where I go into more detail about that, because this isn't really meant to dive too deep into it. But I wanted to show a real world example and tie it into this concept of note length. And that's why I gave the story of when I was early on and I was getting that feedback, and the feedback was that my samples sucked, but no, in actuality, I sucked. I wasn't picking the right articulation, and I wasn't programming it properly. Often my notes would be too long. They weren't accounting for the offset before the attack hit. So the overall result was kind of this lagging sound when it was without the bite and attack that you need for the action music I was trying to create. So hopefully that made sense. Now we're just going to really quickly talk a little bit about velocity, because that was another area that used to stump me back in the day. So first of all, what does velocity mean? Velocity, sort of self-explanatory, but in the context of an instrument and performing, velocity is how hard you hit the instrument. So on a drum, you can have velocity. You can hit the drum really soft, or you can bang the hell out of the drum, right? And all the different variants in between, from very soft all the way up to very hard and loud, and it applies to just about every instrument out there that I can think of. That's what velocity is. And the sample library producers, the people who create these things, they literally record all those different variants. So they'll record a drummer hitting a drum really soft, and a celloist or a violinist playing really soft, and then a little bit louder, and then a little bit louder, a little bit louder. And by the way, I'm saying loud. I don't think that's quite the right term even. It's not necessarily louder. It's actually with more force, which ultimately means it's more louder. But it has a different it has a different sound to it. It's not just the volume, because obviously you can play something soft, but then turn up the volume. It'll play loud, but the tone and the texture of it is going to sound soft. So that's the difference, right? So with velocity here, let's look in my DAW now. I've got my notes selected, and you can see over here I've got, by the way, I'm in Logic, so depending on which DAW you're in, it might look a little different. But here's velocity selected, and as I start moving up, look at the colors of the notes. This is kind of cool, right? Right now, like I think purple is soft, super soft. So I'm going to start cranking these up, moving them up. And by the way, you can see that, look here where the numbers are changing. So right now I have a velocity of 21. at least on this note. We're just looking at this note. And now it's 22, and you keep going up. And these are all, you can kind of think of these of all the different ways that that performer has struck their instrument, whether it's a drum or a cello or a piano, an organ. And now I keep going up, blah, 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 all the way up to the very top. The maximum is 127. And you can see the color is now changed to bright red. So again, this is what Logic does, and a lot of DAWs do similar things. It's just a way of visually showing you how dang hard the instrument's being played. And again, let's go back down to the very bottom. 0 is the, or I guess 1, sorry, is the starting point. So that's the softest you can get. So let's hear what these sound like. So as I lower the velocity, softer, 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 softer. Now they're really, going crazy there. Now, again, I won't go into tremendous amount of detail here because this is just a quick video, but the one thing I will say, and as you start moving these around, I don't know if there's a way to get around this, but see how, like, you want to keep the velocities, you want to vary them. No player is going to play the same velocity level for every time they strike the instrument. So be sure to be aware that you don't want to, for example, see if I can do this. Yeah, that's going to sound, over time, that's going to sound kind of fake and not real, because no one will play every single instrument, or sorry, every single strike of the instrument, whether it's a drum or a piano or a cello in this case, at the same velocity. So you definitely want it to mix up. The one thing, though, you want to be careful of is that with strings, I found, particularly violins, let's get an example of a violin now. Violins, to me, do not sound really good at high velocity. So I'm hitting this string really loud. Not terrible on its own, but sometimes within the context of a piece, you really want that violin to cut through. And at least I did back in the day, I would crank up the velocity on the violin. The problem is, after a while, it can give a really piercing sound. And so often I would just suggest, be aware of when you're particularly working with higher instruments like the violins, probably certain notes on the piano and other higher pitched instruments. In those higher pitched instruments, the higher velocities often sound kind of piercing, I guess is the word. And that was also some of the feedback I would get back in the day when I was starting out, is that I didn't develop my ear enough to really know. I thought I was making the violin sound louder, so I cranked up the violin, and I figured, well, this is a action piece and they're playing really hard and fast and must be loud, so I crank up the velocity to have it cut through. The negative to that is it can make it sound kind of piercing and grating. So that was a real quick thing on velocity. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours and hours studying it, but the quick takeaways is, it goes from from 1 to 127. That's a lot of different variety of velocities you have to play with. So don't just think that everything should be super loud and at the highest, or necessarily the lowest either, right? You have this big range. And in fact, when you're putting a piece together, you want there to be variety. Even if you're sticking kind of at a consistent sound for a while, like if you want something really fast and it's pretty loud and aggressive, even within there, you want the velocities to vary so that it doesn't sound like a machine, right? Because no human being could play the same note the same way every time. And then the other thing that I found a lot is that the higher pitched instruments, like the violins, the higher notes in the violins, can start to sound kind of piercing and grating when the velocities crank. Even if you think it should be, even if you really want it to cut through and it's an action scene and you want those violins to just be soaring, just be careful. It might sound good. I'm not saying that it won't, but often the super high velocities are going to kind of pierce more than I think you would want them to. All right, well, thanks again for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful. Be aware of your note lengths. Start with the right articulation and make sure you're aware of the velocity of every note that you're putting down. It sounds kind of crazy, but you really do got to go fine tune each one of those notes often to get the sound you're after. Now this is, again, as I said at the beginning, just scratching the surface of MIDI programming. So there's a lot of other parameters we have to play with. And in fact, in the next video, I want to talk about modulation and expression, and we will pick it up then next time. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.